The last traces of daylight faded behind the mountains that bordered Prescott, Arizona, painting the sky with streaks of copper and violet. On a quiet stretch of road, the hum of tires was the only sound as Laura Kent guided her old Honda Civic down Iron Springs Road. She had just finished another long shift at the county hospital, where the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, and her heart was heavy with exhaustion. The year was 1994, a time when people still trusted each other enough to leave doors unlocked and neighbors waved from their porches. No one in town could have imagined that this ordinary evening would become the beginning of Prescott's most haunting mystery. If you're drawn to true stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened after that night would leave even seasoned investigators speechless. Laura was 28, known for her kindness and reliability. Her patients adored her. Her co-workers often joked she was the nurse with the flashlight heart. She was engaged to Mark Reynolds, a mechanic with a shy smile and hands always stained with oil. They'd been planning a small wedding for the fall, just close friends, family, and a view of the desert sunset. Their lives seemed set in gentle rhythm, morning coffee, evening drives, laughter shared over diner fries. That Thursday, Laura's shift had ended later than usual. The hospital hallways were nearly empty when she clocked out. Her friend Erin Douglas, a nurse on the same ward, offered to walk her to her car, but Laura declined with a tired smile. "I'm fine, really. Just want to get home, shower, and forget the day." Erin remembered that smile later, how sincere it had looked, how final it felt in hindsight. A faint breeze brushed the parking lot as Laura unlocked her car. Somewhere, a radio played an old country song, static cutting through the melody. She pulled out of the lot, headlights carving through the desert dark. A few miles down the road, the traffic lights flickered. By 10:20 p.m., she was seen passing a gas station security camera, her last confirmed sighting. When Laura didn't arrive home, Mark tried to stay calm. Maybe she'd stopped at her parents' place or stayed late at work. But when midnight came and her phone went unanswered, worry grew like a tightening rope around his chest. He drove to the hospital, to Erin's house, then along the back roads leading to their apartment. Nothing. By dawn, the unease had turned to panic. Prescott woke to the sound of rumors. At first, people assumed her car had broken down. Then the police found it, abandoned just outside town, door unlocked, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of a struggle. The air felt wrong that morning, dry and sharp, as though the desert itself held its breath. Detective Robert Haynes, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, was called in to oversee the case. He stood by the car, sunglasses reflecting the golden light of sunrise, and felt the weight of something that didn't fit the usual pattern. "No skid marks, no fight, no witnesses," he murmured. "It's like she just vanished." Erin arrived at the scene later, trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. She wouldn't run away, she insisted to anyone who'd listen. Laura wouldn't just disappear. As the day stretched on, volunteers gathered. Flyers with Laura's smiling face were taped to storefronts and gas pumps. Helicopters scanned the canyons, their rotors echoing through the empty hills. Yet as the sun dipped once more behind the horizon, hope began to fray. Somewhere in the cooling desert, an unseen truth waited beneath layers of silence. Prescott, once a place of quiet trust, was about to learn how quickly peace can vanish, just like Laura Kent. The morning after Laura Kent's disappearance, Prescott awoke to the uneasy buzz of police radios and whispered speculation. The sun blazed across the desert sky, washing the streets in a pale gold that felt far too bright for such a grim day. At the edge of town, the police had cordoned off the spot where Laura's car sat, untouched since dawn. A faint layer of dust had already begun to gather on the windshield, as if the earth itself wanted to cover the mystery. Detective Robert Haynes stood beside the vehicle, his notepad resting against the hood. He had handled robberies, assaults, even a few homicides, but this one unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Everything about the scene felt too neat. The car was in perfect condition, the driver's seat pulled forward, the purse and keys left behind. "She didn't plan to leave this car," he muttered, scanning the nearby road. Officer Linda Perez joined him, her brow furrowed. No footprints. No drag marks. It's like she just disappeared into the air. People don't just vanish, Haynes replied quietly. Someone saw something. We just have to find who. Back in town, the Prescott Police Department turned into a hive of urgency. Phones rang non-stop, tips poured in, most of them leading nowhere. A gas station clerk remembered seeing a blue car behind Laura's that night, but couldn't recall the driver's face. Another caller swore they'd heard a scream near the canyon road, yet a search turned up nothing but wind and empty desert. By the afternoon, Haynes sat across from Mark Reynolds, Laura's fiancé, in the small interrogation room with flickering fluorescent lights. Mark's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, his hands restless against the metal table. "When was the last time you saw her?" Haynes asked. "Yesterday morning. She left for work around 7. Said she'd be late because of the double shift." Mark swallowed hard. "I called the hospital around 11 last night. They said she left at 10. That's it." Haynes studied him. "Did you argue recently? Any stress between you two?" Mark's expression twisted with disbelief. "We were planning a wedding, Detective. You think I—" He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "I didn't hurt her. I loved her." Haynes didn't respond right away. In missing person cases, the partner was always the first door to knock on. It wasn't personal, it was procedure. But as he looked at Mark's trembling hands, part of him wondered whether guilt or grief caused them to shake. Outside, the parking lot was filling with reporters. Prescott Daily News vans lined the curb, microphones ready. The first headlines had already hit the stands. "Local woman vanishes after work. Fiancé under scrutiny." By evening, hundreds of volunteers had gathered for a search. Locals formed lines that stretched across the brushland, combing through thorny undergrowth and dusty trails. Erin Douglas led a small group from the hospital, clutching a flashlight even in daylight. "We'll find her," she kept saying, her voice wavering each time. "We have to." The search went on until the desert light turned amber and shadows grew long. Dogs barked at nothing, echo bouncing off the rocks. When they found no sign of Laura, not a shoe, not a single belonging, the atmosphere changed. Optimism turned into dread. At headquarters, Haynes pinned a photo of Laura on the investigation board. Her hospital ID picture, smiling, eyes bright and alive. "Every case has a thread," he told his team. "Find the one that unravels this." That night, the detective drove past the empty stretch of Iron Springs Road. The same stars that had watched Laura's last drive glittered coldly above. He rolled down the window, letting the desert wind sting his face. Something about the silence felt wrong, as if the night itself remembered what had happened, and refused to tell. Prescott was no longer the quiet town it had been a week earlier. Every diner conversation, every grocery line whisper revolved around one question. What happened to Laura Kent? Her face stared back from every telephone pole, every coffee shop corkboard, every TV screen that flickered with nightly updates. The once welcoming streets now carried a subtle unease, neighbors locking their doors earlier, parents keeping daughters closer, and glances that lingered too long on anyone who seemed nervous. Detective Robert Haynes felt the pressure building. The case file on his desk grew thicker with each passing day. Yet the pages told him nothing new. The search teams had combed miles of desert. The sniffer dogs had found only sun-baked earth, and every lead ended in a cul-de-sac of speculation. The media had already chosen its narrative. The fiancé knows more than he's saying. That afternoon, Haynes called Mark Reynolds back to the station. The young man looked worn down, his skin pale from sleepless nights and public judgment. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette outside before stepping in, earning disapproving stares from officers who had already made up their minds. "I didn't do this," Mark said before Haynes even spoke. His voice cracked, half anger, half desperation. "People look at me like I killed her. You think I don't hear them?" At the grocery store, at work, hell, even my own customers. Haynes leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I'm not here to judge you, Mark. I'm here to find her. But you have to understand, some of what you've said doesn't line up." Mark's eyes flared. "Like what?" "The neighbor said they heard a fight 2 nights before she vanished." "It wasn't a fight," Mark replied sharply. "She was stressed, that's all. The hospital had been short-staffed. We argued about the wedding expenses, but it was nothing serious. Nothing serious tends to sound louder through thin walls, Haynes said quietly, studying his expression. Mark slammed his hand on the table, then caught himself lowering his voice. I loved her. I'd never hurt her. Outside the interrogation room, Erin Douglas sat in the waiting area, twisting a paper cup of coffee between her palms. She had volunteered for every search, barely slept, and spoke to reporters more than she wanted. When Haynes approached her, she looked up with tired eyes. She wouldn't run away, Erin said softly. Laura was scared of disappointing people, but she wasn't the type to just disappear. Something happened to her, Detective. I can feel it. Did she ever mention anyone bothering her? At work, maybe. Erin hesitated. There was a doctor who used to make her uncomfortable, but she never wanted to file a complaint, said it would make things worse. She looked away. Mark gets angry easily. I've seen him yell at her. Maybe that's why she didn't talk much about home. That small comment became tomorrow's headline. The Prescott Daily News printed it in bold. Tension in Laura Kent's relationship surfaces. Television reporters camped outside the police station, and by evening strangers shouted accusations from their car windows as Mark walked home. Inside his house he sat alone, staring at the engagement photo on the wall. He whispered into the silence, I didn't do it, Laura. You know I didn't. But even as he said it, he wondered if anyone still believed him. For Detective Haynes, the pressure turned personal. The department wanted results, the media wanted closure, and the Kent family wanted justice. Yet all he had were fragments, testimonies laced with emotion, a town ready to turn suspicion into fact, and a growing fear that time was already erasing the truth. And as another night fell over Prescott, the detective knew one thing for certain. In a town this small, secrets never stayed buried for long. They festered, waiting to surface. The weeks turned into months, and the once vibrant search for Laura Kent began to fade like old ink. Prescott's flyers, once crisp and bright, now fluttered in the wind, sun-bleached reminders of a hope losing its color. The search parties grew smaller with each weekend. People had jobs to return to, lives to maintain, and eventually even grief had to make room for routine. Detective Robert Haynes still arrived at his desk before dawn, his coffee always cold before he remembered to drink it. The investigation had reached a cruel stillness. Every lead led nowhere. The phone calls had slowed, the press had turned to fresher stories, and in the silence that followed, Haynes felt the weight of failure pressing deeper into his chest. The forensic lab confirmed what he feared. No fingerprints other than Laura's and Mark's were found in the car. No fibers, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the desert itself had swallowed the truth whole. One morning, Haynes stood in the evidence room, staring at the sealed box labeled Kent Laura, 1994. Inside, one set of car keys, a leather purse, 2 receipts from a gas station, and a faint trace of perfume still clinging to the fabric of her uniform. He closed the box, the scent lingering like a ghost of responsibility he couldn't shake. Across town, Mark Reynolds packed his remaining belongings into an old pickup truck. The whispers had become unbearable. He couldn't walk into a store without hearing murmurs, couldn't meet anyone's eyes without seeing judgment. Erin tried to reach him before he left, but he avoided her calls. By the time she arrived at his house, the for sale sign already leaned crookedly on the dry lawn. She stood on the porch calling out softly, "Mark, please just talk to me." He opened the door, eyes hollow. "There's nothing left to say, Erin. They've already made up their minds. You leaving won't help. It's killing me staying here." He rubbed the back of his neck, voice cracking. "Every time I drive past that road, I see her car in my head. I can't do it anymore." Erin's eyes glistened. "What if she comes back?" Mark shook his head slowly. "Then she'll find out how fast people give up on you." He left that evening, heading south toward Phoenix, his truck disappearing into the dusty horizon. Meanwhile, Haynes continued his rounds, though his motivation had thinned. The police chief began cutting overtime hours, declaring the case temporarily inactive. The public interest had waned, funding was limited, and even the FBI liaison stopped returning calls. At the Kent household, Laura's parents clung to the ritual of keeping her room untouched. Her mother, Martha, dusted the dresser weekly, whispering prayers as she folded the same blanket again and again. Her father sat by the window each night, waiting for headlights that never appeared. Haynes visited them occasionally, though each visit left him heavier. "We're still working every angle," he would say, even when the file hadn't been opened in days. Martha would nod politely, eyes tired but still searching. Late one evening, Haynes drove back along Iron Springs Road, headlights carving through the darkness. He parked where the car had once been found and stepped out, the dry wind scraping against his face. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries stretching into the emptiness. He looked across the silent expanse and whispered to no one, "What did I miss?" The sound of gravel under his boots was the only answer. He returned to his car, the desert behind him quiet as a grave. In his gut, he knew the truth. Unless something changed, Laura Kent's name would soon be just another cold file collecting dust, buried not in sand, but in memory. The Arizona sun hadn't changed, but everything else had. 2 decades had passed since Laura Kent vanished, and Prescott had grown, new subdivisions, a shopping mall, more traffic than anyone once thought possible. Yet in quiet corners, the town still remembered. The missing posters were long gone, but her name still surfaced in hushed conversations, like an unfinished story no one could quite let go of. In 2014, Detective Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the glass cabinet that housed the Prescott Police Department's cold case unit. Rows of dusty files lined the shelves, each one a life frozen in time. She'd transferred from Phoenix a year earlier, bringing with her a reputation for persistence and an unshakable curiosity. Her colleagues joked she had a sixth sense for injustice. She ran her fingers along the folders until she stopped at a faded label, Kent, Laura, 1994. The letters were smudged, the paper yellowed with age. "You've been waiting a long time," she murmured, pulling the file free. Back at her desk, she opened the first report. The photographs were grainy, their corners curled. Laura's smiling face stared back, young, hopeful, alive. Beneath it were crime scene shots, the empty car, the desert road, the evidence list that ended abruptly with the words "case suspended" due to lack of leads. Sarah leaned back, studying the room around her. The hum of air conditioning mixed with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Cold cases had always fascinated her, not because of the tragedy, but because of the silence that followed. Someone had known what happened to Laura Kent. Someone had lived 20 years with that secret. That afternoon she met with Captain Morales, a man nearing retirement who had seen too many files like this one. "Are you serious about reopening it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Sarah replied. "We have new resources, DNA testing, digital analysis, things they didn't have in '94. If there's still evidence, we might get a hit." Morales sighed, glancing at the thick folder. "It destroyed that department for a while. The press, the public, everyone had an opinion. Be ready for pushback if you stir this up again." "I'm not here to stir it up," she said. "I just want to finish it." He studied her a moment, then nodded. "All right, Mitchell. You've got clearance, but keep it quiet until there's something solid." She smiled faintly. "That's the only way I know." That evening she drove the same Iron Springs road where Laura's car had been found 20 years before. The landscape hadn't changed much, still vast, still unforgiving. Cacti stood like sentinels against the setting sun, and the wind carried that dry scent of dust and sage. Sarah parked at the same spot noted in the report and stepped out. The air was heavy with history. She imagined Laura driving home that night, headlights cutting through the dark, unaware that her story was about to stop here. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the hum of the desert fill her thoughts. Back at headquarters, she requested access to the original evidence box. It arrived the next morning, sealed with aged tape and official stamps from 1995. She slit it open carefully. Inside, the faint smell of time hit her. Paper, leather, and something floral. The purse, the keys, the gas receipts. And one more thing that caught her eye, a small envelope marked trace samples. She held it up to the light. "Let's see what 20 years couldn't hide," she whispered. In that quiet moment, something in her heart shifted. The same pull Haynes must have felt back then, the same need to know why. For the first time in 2 decades, the Laura Kent case was no longer cold. It was breathing again, waiting for the truth to surface. Detective Sarah Mitchell sat in the dim light of the evidence lab, the faint hum of fluorescent bulbs echoing her thoughts. The technician carefully unpacked each piece of preserved material from the Laura Kent case, labeling them with modern barcodes before sliding them under microscopes and scanning devices that hadn't existed in 1994. Dust motes floated in the air like memories, and Sarah couldn't help but think of the people who had once touched these objects, the investigators, the family, and Laura herself, unknowingly leaving traces for someone else to find decades later. The results began to trickle in. Most items were too degraded, but the car mat sample caught her attention. It contained traces of industrial-grade oil, not common motor oil, but something heavier, possibly used in machinery. Sarah frowned. Laura's fiancé, Mark Reynolds, had owned a small auto repair shop at the time. It could be coincidence or something else. Still, Sarah knew better than to jump to conclusions. Cold cases were like puzzles with missing edges, easy to misread if you forced the pieces to fit. She needed context. She started by calling people who had lived through the original investigation. Most were older now, some retired, some unwilling to reopen the wounds. But Erin Douglas, Laura's best friend, agreed to meet. They met at a small cafe off Gurley Street, the kind with cracked leather booths and the faint scent of burnt coffee. Erin arrived quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, her hair streaked with grey. When she saw Laura's photo on Sarah's table, her eyes softened with an ache that hadn't dulled with time. "I still dream about her sometimes," Erin said, voice trembling. "She's always walking ahead of me, but I can never catch up." Sarah nodded gently. "I've read your original statements, but I want to hear it in your words. What was Laura like during those last weeks?" Erin hesitated, tracing the rim of her cup. Tired, overworked, but distracted too, like something was bothering her. I asked once if it was Mark, but she said no. She said she felt watched. Watched? Sarah's tone sharpened slightly. Yes, she said some of the night security guys at the hospital made her uncomfortable. There was one in particular, Tom, I think. Always tried to talk to her during shifts. Sarah made a note. Did she report it? Erin shook her head. Laura never wanted to cause trouble. She thought people would say she was imagining things. The words lingered, heavy and unshakable. Sarah thanked her and promised to keep her updated. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed against her as she walked back to her car. The sound of cicadas filled the air, loud, insistent and endless. Back at headquarters, she reviewed the hospital's old employment logs. Dozens of staff had come and gone over the years, but a name did appear. Tom Mendez, night security, terminated shortly after Laura's disappearance for unexplained absenteeism. It was a small lead, but in a cold case, even a flicker mattered. That night, she returned home late, her apartment filled with files and scribbled notes. The desert wind rattled the window panes as she reread the testimonies of 1994. Each word carried the weight of what people didn't say. She imagined Laura stepping into her car that night, the darkness pressing close, headlights stretching down a lonely road. Her phone buzzed, an email from the lab confirming the oil's chemical profile. The report noted it was used primarily in older automotive lifts, the kind found in small-town garages. Sarah sat still for a long time, her pulse steady but cold. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But the past was stirring, and with every line she read, she felt Prescott's silence begin to crack open, one truth at a time. Detective Sarah Mitchell drove south the following week, the sun hanging low over the Arizona desert, like a glowing coin. The old case file sat on the passenger seat beside her, its pages fluttering with each gust from the half-open window. She was on her way to find Mark Reynolds, Laura Kent's former fiancé, the man once branded guilty in whispers but never charged. Mark lived outside Tucson, in a quiet neighborhood where time moved slower. His house was small, worn at the edges, the kind of place that belonged to someone who had learned to live unnoticed. When he opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to caution. "You're with Prescott PD?" he asked, voice gravelly from years of silence. "Cold Case Division," Sarah replied, showing her badge. "I'm reviewing Laura Kent's file." His jaw tightened. "After 20 years, what for?" "I'm not here to accuse you," she said calmly. "I'm here to understand." He hesitated before letting her in. The living room was neat but lonely. No photos on the walls, no trace of a shared life. A single mechanic's calendar hung near the kitchen, a smudge of oil marking the current month. "I read your old statements," Sarah began, sitting across from him. "You said you were home that night, fell asleep waiting for her." "That's right," Mark said, leaning back. "I told Haynes the same thing." Sarah nodded slowly. "I also know you closed your garage around 8 that evening. Records show the shop's phone line went inactive an hour earlier." "That's when Laura left work." He stiffened, eyes narrowing. "What are you getting at?" "I'm just checking timelines," she replied evenly. "We found traces of industrial lift oil in her car, similar to what your garage used. Could be nothing. Could be something." Mark rubbed a hand over his face, a tired motion. "You think I don't know how that sounds?" "You think I haven't gone over that night 1,000 times. I didn't touch her car, Detective. Not that night, not ever." There was no anger in his voice now, only exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying suspicion for too long. Sarah studied him carefully, searching for cracks in the armor. "Then help me understand, was there anyone else Laura mentioned? Anyone who made her uncomfortable?" He looked away for a long moment. The ticking of the wall clock filled the space between them. Finally, he spoke. "There was someone at the hospital, a security guy. Big guy, always hanging around her. She said once he gave her a bad feeling." Sarah leaned forward. "Do you remember his name?" "Tom," Mark said quietly. "Tom something. Mendez, maybe." "I didn't think much of it then. Figured he was just another creep trying to talk to a pretty woman." She wrote the name in her notebook. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Mark's expression hardened. "Because no one was listening back then. The cops wanted it to be me. They never looked anywhere else." Sarah didn't respond immediately. His bitterness was earned. She could feel it in his words. "Times have changed," she finally said. "We follow the evidence now, not the rumors." Mark gave a dry laugh. "Then maybe you'll do what they couldn't. Find her." As she stood to leave, he walked her to the door. The evening air was cooling, carrying the scent of motor oil and desert dust. "Detective," he said, his voice low, "if you do find out what happened, don't tell me first. Tell Erin. She's the one who never stopped believing." Sarah met his gaze, the last light of sunset flickering in his eyes. "I will," she promised. Driving back toward Prescott, the desert stretched endless and quiet before her. The name Tom Mendez echoed in her mind, a faint thread of truth pulling her deeper into the shadows Laura Kent had left behind. Detective Sarah Mitchell couldn't shake the name Tom Mendez. It sat in her notes like an unanswered question. The next morning she returned to headquarters determined to trace every record tied to him. Most files from the 1990s had been digitized, though poorly. Pages scanned crooked, ink faded. After hours of scrolling through employment rosters and termination logs from the hospital, she found him. Thomas R. Mendez, hired in late 1993, terminated in July 1994, exactly 1 week after Laura Kent vanished. Her pulse quickened. The reason for dismissal read, "Repeated absenteeism, no contact. No follow-up investigation, no further note. Just silence." Sarah leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen. "He didn't just quit," she murmured. "He ran." She began pulling additional records, driver's license, past addresses, employment history. Mendez had relocated several times over the years, Nevada, Utah, then back to Arizona. His last known residence was listed in Henderson, Nevada, under a slightly altered name, Thomas Mendez R. That alone was suspicious. Before proceeding, she decided to hear more from Erin Douglas. If anyone could recall details about the man, it was her. When Sarah arrived at Erin's small house near Willow Creek, she found her watering plants under the orange glow of sunset. Erin smiled faintly when she saw her. "You've been busy," she said, setting the watering can down. "I think I might have found someone who deserves a second look," Sarah replied. "Do you remember a security guard at the hospital named Tom Mendez?" Erin froze mid-motion. "Tom? God, yes. He was always around, friendly at first, but Laura didn't like him. She said he'd show up near the nurses' parking lot when she left late." Sarah watched her closely. "Did she ever tell anyone about it?" "She told me once she thought he followed her home. I told her to tell her supervisor, but she laughed it off, said she didn't want to cause drama." Erin's voice softened. Laura tried so hard to see the good in people. She didn't believe someone could really mean harm. Sarah jotted down notes quickly. "You never mentioned this during the original investigation." Erin's face fell. "They never asked. Everyone was so focused on Mark. The police treated him like the only possibility. After a while, I started believing maybe they were right. But I never stopped wondering." The confession lingered in the dry air between them. Erin's guilt was quiet but heavy, like dust settling after years of stillness. Later that night, back at her desk, Sarah cross-referenced Mendez's name with state employment systems. A pattern emerged. Short-term jobs, mostly security work, never more than a year at each. The record suggested a man who kept moving, always leaving just before questions caught up with him. She opened a folder of archived news clippings. In 1996, a small Nevada paper had reported a local woman's harassment complaint against a man named Tom Mendez, dismissed after he disappeared before questioning. Sarah's stomach tightened. The same pattern: proximity, fear, and silence. She printed out his photo from a decades-old ID record. The face that stared back was hard to read. Heavy-set, dark eyes, a faint smirk. She imagined Laura's discomfort, her instinct to shrug it off, her quiet fear that no one would take her seriously. Sarah shut her eyes, drawing a slow breath. After 20 years, the case was no longer abstract. It had a face again, a man who'd slipped through the cracks. The next step was clear. She would confirm whether Mendez was still alive, still hiding behind another name. But in her gut she already knew, men like him didn't vanish forever. They waited, confident the world had forgotten. And for 20 years, it had. But not anymore. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived early at the forensics lab, a styrofoam cup of coffee trembling slightly in her hand. She hadn't slept much. The name Tom Mendez had replayed in her head all night, looping between suspicion and certainty. Now, as she stood before the lab technician, she knew something was about to shift. "Detective," the tech began, adjusting his glasses. "You wanted the update on the trace evidence from the Kent file." Sarah nodded, heartbeat quickening. He handed her a printed sheet. "We ran the DNA again using updated sequencing. We got a partial match, one that wasn't in the system before, but now it is. It belongs to a man named Thomas R. Mendez, currently living in Nevada." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The sterile hum of the lab seemed distant, swallowed by the gravity of the revelation. "You're sure?" she asked quietly. "Positive. The sample's old, but the match is strong enough to pursue legally." Sarah took the paper, her mind racing. 20 years of silence, and finally, a voice from the evidence box was speaking. By afternoon, she had contacted the Nevada authorities. A joint task force was quickly assembled, discreet but determined. Mendez was still working as a night security guard, same line of work, same pattern. Sarah's instincts hardened into conviction. "He didn't just move on," she said to Captain Morales. "He repeated the same behavior in new towns. We just never caught him early enough." Morales studied her, skeptical but supportive. "You think he killed Laura Kent? I think he knows exactly what happened," Sarah replied. "And it's time we ask him." The next 48 hours passed in tense coordination. Warrants were processed, logistics arranged. Sarah reviewed every document she'd gathered, the hospital reports, Erin's recollections, Mark's quiet bitterness. All of it pointed to one man who had vanished right when Laura did. When the call finally came from Nevada PD, Sarah was mid-sentence writing a report. "Detective Mitchell, we've got him," the officer said. "Picked him up leaving work." He didn't resist. Her pen stopped moving. "I'm on my way." By the time she arrived in Henderson, the interrogation room was ready. Through the one-way mirror, Sarah saw Tom Mendez, older now, heavier, but unmistakable. His hands rested calmly on the table, fingers interlocked. His expression wasn't fear or confusion. It was resignation, as if he'd been expecting this knock for years. When she entered, he glanced up. "You're not from around here," he said, voice rough. "Prescott, Arizona," Sarah replied. "I'm here about Laura Kent." A flicker crossed his eyes. Recognition, maybe even guilt, but it vanished quickly. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "Not long enough," Sarah said. She laid a photo of Laura on the table. "You knew her. You worked the night she disappeared." Mendez leaned back, eyes on the picture. "She was nice, too nice, the kind of girl who smiled even when she was tired. You don't forget faces like that." "Then why did you quit your job a week later?" He smirked faintly. "Didn't like the hours?" Sarah leaned forward. "We found your DNA in her car." That wiped the smirk away. His jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to his hands. The silence stretched long enough to make her heart pound. Finally, he spoke, his tone quiet, but deliberate. "You think you know what happened. You don't." "Then tell me," Sarah said. He hesitated, then exhaled, a sound more weary than defiant. "It was supposed to be a conversation. That's all. I never meant for it to go wrong." Her breath caught. "What do you mean, go wrong?" Mendez's voice dropped to a whisper. "She fell. It was an accident." Sarah stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. 2 decades of silence, and now, finally, a confession was beginning to surface. But even as the words hung in the air, she knew the hardest part was still to come, finding proof that would turn his admission into justice. When news broke that Thomas Mendez had been arrested in Nevada, Prescott's calm facade cracked wide open. Local stations led with flashing headlines, radio talk shows buzzed with theories, and old wounds reopened faster than anyone could brace for. For the first time in 20 years, Laura Kent's name was everywhere again, spoken with grief, anger, and disbelief. Detective Sarah Mitchell returned to Arizona, with a file full of statements and a heart heavy with what she had heard. Mendez had confessed to an accident, but no one in town was ready to believe that word. It sounded too easy, too convenient. At the Kent family's modest home, Martha and Harold Kent sat together on the porch as reporters lined the street. Martha held Laura's old photograph in trembling hands, whispering the same sentence over and over, as if repetition might make it real. They found him. They finally found him. Inside the house, every corner carried echoes of the daughter they had lost, the framed nursing diploma, the untouched room with its neatly folded quilt, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to her old dresser. For years they had prayed for answers. Now that they had one, peace felt impossible. Erin Douglas was at work when the alert came through her phone. She froze mid-shift, the hospital corridor spinning slightly as she read the words, "Arrest made in 1994, Prescott missing woman case." A colleague touched her shoulder. "Erin, you okay?" She forced a nod. "I just, need a minute." Outside, she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. "They got him, Laura," she whispered. "After all this time." Tears came slowly, not with relief, but with something sharper, a realization that closure always came tangled with pain. Meanwhile, Sarah stood before a room full of reporters, answering questions she'd prepared for but didn't want to face. "Detective, is the suspect cooperating?" one journalist called out. "He's made partial admissions," Sarah said evenly. "We're still verifying his statements with new searches and forensic testing." "Is this case officially considered solved?" another asked. She paused. "Not until every part of Laura Kent's story is confirmed." That night, the town gathered at the local park for an impromptu vigil. Candles flickered in paper cups, casting soft halos on faces that hadn't aged kindly through the years of waiting. The air smelled faintly of wax and desert sage. Someone played a quiet melody on guitar while others stood in silence. Erin found herself standing beside Martha Kent, neither speaking at first. Finally, Martha whispered, "Do you think she was scared?" Erin swallowed hard. "No. I think she was brave. She always was." The older woman nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I keep thinking about how many birthdays we missed. 20 of them. I just want her home now." Across town, in a quiet motel room, Sarah sat by the window, reviewing transcripts of Mendez's interview. Each line of his confession played differently in her mind now, filtered through the faces of the people who'd waited for justice. He had said Laura's name softly, almost tenderly. He had claimed panic, remorse, confusion, but there had been no trembling in his voice, no hint of regret in his eyes. Sarah's gut told her there was more beneath the surface. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, rare for Prescott's dry skies. Sarah stared at the dark horizon, the storm brewing somewhere beyond the hills, and whispered to herself, "We're not done yet." The next morning, newspapers carried the same headline in bold black print: "Arrest made in Laura Kent case. Community reeling from new details." But beneath the relief and the shock, one truth remained clear. Closure wasn't the same as peace. For Prescott, the story wasn't over. It was only beginning to settle into the hearts of those who had lived it. The courthouse in Prescott hadn't seen this much attention in decades. Reporters lined the steps, their cameras pointed toward the heavy wooden doors, as if the truth itself would walk out at any moment. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. After months of preparation, Thomas Mendez was finally standing trial for the disappearance and death of Laura Kent. Detective Sarah Mitchell sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. She had spent every day preparing evidence, reviewing testimonies, ensuring the story Laura never got to tell would be heard now. Still, as the proceedings began, a cold unease settled in her chest. Cases like this rarely ended cleanly. The prosecutor, Ellen Ross, a sharp, composed woman with decades in criminal law, opened with a steady voice. The defendant abused his position of authority to harass and intimidate a young woman, she told the jury, and when she refused his advances, he made sure she would never return home. For 20 years he lived freely while her family suffered in silence. Mendez sat motionless beside his attorney, expression unreadable. When the judge asked for his plea, he said the same words he'd said in every interrogation since his arrest. "Not guilty of murder. It was an accident." Sarah's stomach tightened at that word again. Accident. The prosecution called its first witnesses, forensic analysts who confirmed the DNA match, officers who had preserved the old evidence, and finally Erin Douglas, whose quiet strength filled the room as she took the stand. Erin's voice trembled at first. "Laura was my best friend," she began. "She was kind, dependable. She worked herself to exhaustion, always putting others first." The prosecutor nodded. "Did she ever tell you she felt unsafe?" Erin swallowed hard. "Yes. She mentioned Tom Mendez, said he watched her at work, followed her sometimes. I told her to report it, but she didn't want to make trouble. Do you recognize the man who frightened her?" Erin's eyes met Mendez's across the room. Her tone hardened. "Yes, it's him." A murmur rippled through the gallery. When it was the defense's turn, Mendez's lawyer argued that the case lacked direct evidence of intent. "Mr. Mendez has admitted to meeting Ms. Kent that night," the attorney said, "but there is no proof he planned harm. It was a tragic misunderstanding, a moment of panic that went horribly wrong." The jurors shifted uneasily, caught between logic and emotion. Later, Mendez took the stand himself. His voice was calm, almost practiced. "I didn't mean for her to get hurt," he said. "I wanted to talk to her. She was angry, said she'd report me. She tripped, hit her head on the rocks. I didn't know what to do." "Why didn't you call for help?" Ellen Ross demanded, her tone sharp. "I was scared," Mendez said. "I'd lose everything, so I buried her." The words hung heavy, suffocating the room. Even after 2 decades, hearing them spoken aloud made the horror real in a way paper never could. When the session adjourned, Sarah stepped outside into the fading light. Reporters shouted questions, but she barely heard them. Erin approached, eyes red but fierce. "You think they'll believe him?" Sarah shook her head. "They'll believe Laura." The trial stretched for days, each testimony another piece of a puzzle finally taking shape. The jurors listened, the town watched, and somewhere within the walls of the courthouse, the weight of 20 lost years began to tilt toward justice. And as the final day neared, Sarah knew only one truth remained to be decided: whether the jury would call what happened to Laura Kent an accident or finally name it for what it was. The morning of the verdict was cloudless. The Arizona sky stretched wide and pale above the courthouse. People began gathering before sunrise: reporters, locals, even those who hadn't known Laura Kent personally, but felt somehow connected to her story. The air buzzed with anticipation and a low hum of tension, the kind that comes when justice hangs in the balance. Detective Sarah Mitchell sat inside the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had attended every hearing, every motion, every long testimony that stripped the years of silence away layer by layer. But this was the moment she had carried all her effort toward. Across the room sat Thomas Mendez, wearing a dark suit that did little to disguise the wear of his years. His eyes darted occasionally toward the jury box, but never toward the gallery, where Erin Douglas and the Kent family waited, their faces a mixture of dread and fragile hope. The bailiff's voice broke through the murmurs. "All rise." Everyone stood as the jury filed in. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with steady eyes, held the verdict slip in her trembling hands. The silence that followed was deep enough to make every heartbeat feel audible. "On the charge of manslaughter in the death of Laura Kent," the judge read, "we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A sound escaped Martha Kent's throat, part sob, part breath of relief. Erin reached for her hand, tears slipping freely down both their faces. Sarah exhaled slowly, her body finally releasing a tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the first day she reopened the case. Mendez didn't react. His expression stayed fixed, unreadable, as if the words hadn't registered. When the judge announced his sentence, 25 years without parole, he simply lowered his gaze. Afterward, as people filtered out of the courtroom, Sarah lingered near the back. Erin approached her, eyes red but resolute. "You did it," she said softly. Sarah shook her head. "No, Laura did. She left enough behind for us to find her." Erin smiled faintly. "You gave her voice back. That matters." Outside, the courthouse steps were lined with cameras. Reporters shouted questions about closure, about justice, but to Sarah the word closure felt too neat, too small. What had been restored today wasn't peace, it was truth. Later that afternoon, she visited the small memorial at the hospital where Laura had once worked. The staff had placed fresh flowers beneath a plaque engraved with her name. The scent of lilies mingled with the faint antiseptic air of the corridors. A nurse recognized her. "You're the detective, right? The one who reopened her case?" Sarah nodded. The nurse smiled gently. "Thank you. My mom worked here with Laura. She said she was one of the kindest people she ever knew." Those words lingered as Sarah stepped outside again. The sun had dipped low, the horizon painted in shades of amber and rose. She thought of all the people Laura had touched, patients, friends, family, and how far those ripples had traveled, even after she was gone. That night, Erin visited the Kent home, bringing dinner for Martha and Harold. The old couple looked tired but lighter, as if a shadow had finally begun to lift. Martha clasped Erin's hands and whispered, "Now she can rest." Across town, in a quiet office filled with case files and photographs, Sarah opened Laura's folder one last time. She added a final note to the bottom of the report. Case closed. Justice achieved. Then she sat back and let herself breathe. Outside her window, the desert wind stirred, carrying with it the faint sound of distant church bells. For the first time in decades, Prescott felt still, not empty, but whole. Months passed after the verdict, and Prescott began to breathe again. The courthouse steps were no longer crowded, the news vans gone. The rhythm of daily life returned, quiet, ordinary, but different. Beneath the calm surface, something in the town had shifted. People smiled more cautiously, spoke Laura Kent's name with tenderness instead of sorrow, and carried the unspoken truth that justice, even delayed, could still arrive. Detective Sarah Mitchell remained in Prescott longer than planned. Officially, she was finishing paperwork and assisting with follow-up reports. Unofficially, she wasn't ready to let go. The Laura Kent case had become more than an assignment. It had become personal. On her desk sat a photo of Laura, the same one used on missing posters decades earlier. Sarah often caught herself looking at it, wondering how such a bright life could leave behind such a long shadow. She met Erin Douglas one morning at a small cafe downtown. The light filtering through the window softened the weariness in Erin's face. "You're staying?" Erin asked as they settled with their coffee. "For a little while," Sarah said. "There's still paperwork, but maybe I just need to slow down." Erin nodded. "I understand. I don't think any of us are ready to move on completely." They sat quietly for a moment before Erin continued. "You know, the hospital's starting a scholarship in Laura's name for nursing students who work the night shift. She'd like that." A faint smile touched Sarah's lips. "She'd be proud of you for doing it." "It wasn't just me," Erin said. "Half the town donated. Even Mark sent a check from Tucson. He wrote a note, said it was the least he could do to honor her." Sarah felt a quiet ache at the mention of Mark Reynolds. The man who had once been the focus of suspicion now lived in self-imposed solitude, haunted by a story that had nearly destroyed him. Guilt, even undeserved, was a heavy thing. Later that week, Sarah visited the Kent home. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood. Martha Kent opened the door, her movements slow but graceful. "Detective," she greeted warmly. "Or should I say Sarah now?" "Sarah's fine," she replied, smiling. Harold joined them in the living room, holding a photo album. "We've been putting these together," he said, flipping through pages of yellowed photos. Laura as a child in pigtails, her nursing school graduation, family barbecues, Christmas mornings. "We want to remember her for how she lived, not how she was taken." Sarah ran her hand lightly over one of the pictures. "She mattered," she said softly. "And she still does." Martha's eyes filled with tears, but her smile held steady. "Thank you for not giving up on her." After leaving their home, Sarah drove toward the outskirts of town. The desert stretched endless before her, painted gold by the afternoon sun. She parked near the hospital, where a small memorial garden had been built for Laura. A plaque read, "Her kindness outlasted her years." She stood there for a long while, listening to the wind rustling through the mesquite trees. For the first time in months, her thoughts felt still. Justice hadn't erased the pain, but it had given it meaning. Back at the police station, a new stack of old files waited, other cold cases, other names left in silence. Sarah ran her fingers over them, feeling that familiar pull. She knew she would keep doing this work, not because she needed closure, but because every forgotten name deserved a chance to be found. That night, Erin called her. "We're holding a small service at the hospital next week," she said. "For Laura. Nothing formal, just candles and music." Sarah smiled softly. "I'll be there." As she hung up, the desert sky deepened into indigo, stars flickering one by one. For the first time in 20 years, Prescott's night felt lighter, like something broken had finally begun to heal. Detective Sarah Mitchell woke before dawn, the pale light just beginning to creep across the desert horizon. The hum of her ceiling fan filled the quiet room, a sound she'd come to depend on in the months since the trial. She lay still for a moment, listening, her mind already turning back to the Laura Kent case, not with anxiety, but with a strange, steady peace. The investigation had changed her. Every case left its mark, but this one had carved deeper. It wasn't only the brutality of what had happened, or the years of silence that followed. It was the persistence of love, of memory, of people refusing to let the truth vanish with time. Laura's story had become more than a mystery to solve. It had been a mirror reflecting everything Sarah believed about justice and the fragility of human life. At the station, her desk looked emptier now. The old box labelled Kent, Laura, 1994, had been sent to archives, sealed for good. A small note sat where it once rested, a handwritten message from Erin. "You gave her back to us. Thank you." Sarah traced the letters with her fingertips. Gratitude was a rare thing in her line of work, and this simple gesture meant more than she could say. Later that morning, she drove out to the site where Laura's remains had been found. The air was crisp, the desert wind whistling through dry brush and open rock. The landscape stretched endlessly, as if nothing could ever hide here again. She stood quietly, hands in her pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I used to think closure meant answers," she whispered to herself. "Now I think it means learning to live with the questions." A hawk circled high above, its cry echoing faintly through the canyons. Sarah felt small beneath the expanse of sky, but also grounded, as if the earth itself had absorbed part of Laura's story, carrying it forward. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, Captain Morales checking in. "Mitchell," his voice came through, warm but teasing. "So you planning on staying out there forever?" "Maybe," she said with a faint smile. "It's quiet here." "You've earned the quiet," Morales replied. "But when you're ready, we've got another case waiting. Cold one, different town, same kind of mystery." Sarah hesitated. "Send it over when you can." As she hung up, she looked around once more, feeling the soft heat of the sun on her face. The road behind her shimmered with light, winding back toward Prescott, a town forever marked yet finally free from the weight of not knowing. That afternoon, she stopped by the Prescott Hospital. In the lobby, the new Laura Kent Memorial Scholarship plaque gleamed beside a vase of fresh flowers. Beneath it, a quote was engraved: "Kindness leaves a trace that time cannot erase." A group of young nurses passed by, chatting softly. One of them paused to read the plaque and whispered, "I want to be like her." The words caught Sarah off guard. She felt her throat tighten, a mix of pride and sorrow she couldn't quite name. Outside, she walked toward her car, pausing for a long look at the setting sun spilling across the desert. The world looked almost the same as when she'd first arrived, same roads, same sky, but she wasn't the same woman. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't a final act. It was a choice repeated every day, to keep searching, to keep remembering, to keep believing that truth matters, even when it comes too late. As she started the engine, the radio played softly, an old country song about coming home. Sarah smiled, eyes glistening. For the first time in a long while, she felt exactly where she was meant to be. The evening air in Prescott carried a soft chill as the town gathered once more, this time not for justice, but remembrance. The park's lights glowed gently against the darkening sky, and candles flickered in quiet unison. 20 years of grief had finally come full circle. People who had once searched those dusty roads now stood side by side, holding the same hope, that Laura Kent would never be forgotten. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived quietly, blending into the crowd. She hadn't planned to speak, only to listen. Around her, voices murmured stories, patients who remembered Laura's kindness at the hospital, neighbors who'd once seen her walking to work, friends who still spoke of her laughter. Each voice painted another piece of who Laura had been, until the air itself seemed to hum with her presence. At the front of the park, Erin Douglas stood before the small memorial. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "For years," she began, voice breaking, "we lived with questions that didn't have answers. We searched, we hoped, and we prayed. And even when it felt impossible, we didn't stop believing that the truth would find its way back to us." She paused, scanning the faces illuminated by candlelight. Laura was more than a tragedy. She was love. She was laughter. And she is still with us in the patience she healed, in the lives she touched, and in the courage that brought us all here tonight. A hush fell over the crowd as she stepped back. The wind shifted gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust. For a moment it felt as though the desert itself was listening. Sarah approached Erin afterward, the two women sharing a silent embrace. No words were needed. The bond between them, between seeker and survivor, was something beyond language. Nearby, Martha and Harold Kent sat together on a bench, their hands intertwined. Martha looked up at Sarah as she approached. "She's home now," she said softly. "That's what matters." Sarah nodded. "You gave her the love that time couldn't take away." Harold's voice, rough with age, carried a quiet strength. "You gave her justice. That's all we ever wanted." Later that night, when the crowd had thinned and the candles had burned low, Sarah stayed behind. The sky above Prescott was vast and endless, the stars stretching brighter than she remembered. She thought about Laura, about the life stolen too soon, and the legacy that had somehow survived it all. In her pocket, Sarah carried a folded piece of paper, her final report on the case. She took it out, looking at the last line she'd written in careful ink. "Justice delayed is not justice denied, it's a promise kept." She placed the note beneath the memorial plaque, a quiet offering. "Rest easy, Laura," she whispered. "We found you." As she turned to leave, the sound of footsteps approached. Erin had returned, holding a single candle still burning in her hand. "You're leaving tomorrow, aren't you?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Yeah. Time for the next file, the next story that needs a voice." Erin's eyes shone in the candlelight. "Then promise me something. Don't forget this one." "I couldn't if I tried," Sarah said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "She changed more than a town. She changed me." They stood there a moment longer, watching the flame dance against the breeze before it finally went out. As Sarah walked back toward her car, the town lights shimmered behind her. Somewhere in the distance, a new day waited to begin. But for Prescott, this night would linger, a quiet victory over time, loss, and silence. And for everyone still listening, Laura Kent's story had become something eternal. Proof that truth, no matter how long it hides, will always find its way home.